Video is going to be covering the slides of the autonomic nervous system. So as we discussed, the autonomic nervous system usually divided into two portions, a parasympathetic and a sympathetic division with afferent and efferent subsystems providing feedback and sending out impulses. Within these systems, there are inhibitory and excitatory synapses between neurons. And these inhibitory and excitatory synapses are going to dictate what happens at each of our autonomic nervous system destinations. So the destination of the autonomic nervous system, these destinations that they're going to go to are going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, blood vessels, and glands. And then I assume this goes without saying, but these processes of the autonomic nervous system usually function below involuntary consciousness. For example, our heart rate, we don't sit there and constantly think about it, pushing blood to a certain part of our body, activating certain glands. We don't sit there and think about that. Those are all going to be controlled involuntarily. So as I discussed, each portion of the autonomic nervous system is going to have a preganglionic and a postganglionic cell, which meets up at a ganglion. And a ganglion is just a collection, it's a cluster of cell bodies. And so that's why we call them pre and post, because they meet up at this bulged area that's going to be just a cluster of cell bodies. One thing that's going to be important to note is our preganglionic cells are myelinated, while our postganglionic cells are unmyelinated. And when you pair that with what we were talking about on Friday and think about the speed at which some of these things might happen, this myelination is going to play a role in that. So this slide is just going to compare and contrast a little bit of the differences between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic. One of the biggest contrasting points is going to be our somatic system. We can control it, right? We sit there and think about moving our arm, or we think about walking, but our autonomic nervous system is going to be involuntary. And then you can go through one neuron, two neurons here in the autonomic ganglia. There's not going to be any, but here there's going to be ganglia because we have a synapse, etc., etc. You can see as we go down, acetylcholine's the main effector, on skeletal muscle fibers, which only acts to excite. The destination of autonomic cardiac smooth muscle fibers glands either inhibits or excites, either way, acetylcholine or norepinephrine. So there is some differences between those two systems. So now we're going to dive a little bit more into the divisions of the autonomic: sympathetic versus parasympathetic, fight or flight in the sympathetic, and rest and digest in the parasympathetic. And then here's a little bit about that enteric nervous system. So this slide is going to decipher what we were talking about the other day. So this here is the sympathetic nervous system. This here is the parasympathetic nervous system with a single nerve pathway which is affected, and the relative lengths of those axons. Each of them are going to be acting on the exact same systems. They're just going to go about it in different ways. So that sympathetic nervous system is going to originate here. Let's see if we can pull it up. The thoracolumbar division. So this is going to be T1 to L2. So that thoracolumbar division of the sympathetic nervous system, it's going to have a relatively short preganglionic nerve fiber, acetylcholine synapsing on a postganglionic nerve fiber, which is going to be long. There's a slide here that I want to throw in conjunction. So our sympathetic nervous system is going to travel down the typical spinal nerve from the spinal cord, through the ventral ramus, and then it's going to come up and hit the chain ganglion, which we talked about, as part of our typical spinal nerve. Inside of that chain ganglion, it's going to go out, and there's going to be multiple synapses that are going to happen for this preganglionic neuron. And again, I want you to think conceptually, because when our sympathetic nervous system amps up, we need to have a huge body response that is affected due to this fight or flight mechanism. Our heart rate needs to rise. Our lungs need to start breathing faster. We need to start pushing blood to big muscle groups. We need to inhibit, bowel, bladder. We need to, our eyes are going to dilate. So there needs to be several functions that happen simultaneously. And so inside of this, we're going to have multiple synapses with these preganglionic nerves onto a relatively long, we're talking sympathetic nervous system, onto a relatively long postganglionic fiber, which is then going to go and enact on several, because we're synapsing on several postganglionic fibers, we're going to have major body-wide response. So this slide here is just looking at these terminal, I've lost the word. These effectors. Anyway, I lost the word. These excitatory and inhibitory chemicals. So we're going to have acetylcholine always between the pre and postganglionic fiber, and then acetylcholine in the parasympathetic nervous system, and often, but not always, norepinephrine in the sympathetic nervous system. Already mentioned this. Relatively short into a long fiber. Long in the parasympathetic, a long preganglionic fiber into a relatively short postganglionic fiber, more directed. This is going to be more directed when we get in there. So the function, increase heart rate. We need to start breathing faster, get more air into the lung, increase capacity of muscles. So these affect these, but we're also going to have inhibitory portions of the sympathetic like I mentioned, at the bladder. This is not the time to be thinking about needing to urinate, right? This is a fight or flight instance, and that needs to be pushed on to later. As I mentioned, thoracolumbar division. It's going to be right through here, thoracolumbar division with its chain ganglion. That chain ganglion is going to actually extend up and down the entire spinal column. It's just we're only going to receive input on that chain ganglion at this region, the thoracolumbar division of the spinal cord. Here we go into the chain ganglion. After traveling a short way in the ventral rami, all preganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers leave the rami and enter one of the chain ganglia. So here we go, a diagram to help us understand this. So the sympathetic nerve fiber, T1 to L2, we're going to leave the spinal cord, travel down the ventral rootlets or the anterior rootlets. We're going to go into the spinal nerve. You can see labeled here, the spinal nerve. We're just going to enter this ventral ramus for just a second. And then we're going to enter this white communicating ramus. This is white. If you remember back to your nerve physiology, this one is going to be white because these preganglionic fibers are myelinated. They are then going to synapse on several different postganglionic nerve fibers. Here in this diagram, it has this preganglionic nerve fiber traveling up and down the chain ganglion, which is totally fine. That happens because we need to affect in multiple places. So this single nerve fiber is going to go and travel up and down and around and all over. And then it's going to synapse on these postganglionic fibers. Those postganglionic fibers are going to exit the chain ganglion via a gray communicating ramus. The reason this is gray is because it's going to be unmyelinated. Okay, so we have a white coming in where it's myelinated, and then it's going to exit via a gray communicating ramus because it is unmyelinated, and then go cause its effect on the effector organs. This slide kind of sums up that idea of the communicans, those white and gray. So connecting the spinal nerves to each sympathetic trunk. The white carry preganglionic axons between T1 and L2. The gray are going to be all over the place. The gray are going to be all over the place because they are going to extend up into the cervical and sacral regions of the spinal cord. However, at the cervical and sacral regions, they don't have an entrance of a sympathetic nerve system. And so we are only going to have gray in the cervical and sacral regions, and then we'll also have gray, we'll also have gray in the thoracolumbar region. Hopefully that makes sense. I might hit on that again just to make sure it's clear on Monday. Okay, so moving on. This slide is just giving us the idea that the sympathetic nervous system with all of its various preganglionic fibers, it can synapse at the same level, it can go up or down, or it can pass through the chain ganglia without synapsing. This is an instance I didn't talk about. It can go through the chain ganglia without synapsing. Preganglionic neurons below the diaphragm are collectively called splanchnic nerves. Splanchnic nerves synapse in collateral ganglia. Okay, so there's a separate set of ganglia where we can go out and synapse on those ganglia outside of the chain ganglia. Another diagram here indicating that white and gray communicans. We're going to come in through the white, myelinated, and out through the gray, unmyelinated, go and have an effect on an effector organ. A diagram here. The thing I think that is worthwhile to glean from this diagram is just notice the input into the chain ganglia through this thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. And then once we get out, we don't have that input anymore because now we're in the craniosacral division, which is parasympathetic, which is going to bypass this chain ganglia. Okay, so now we're into the parasympathetic division of the nervous system. Rest and digest, mostly active during times when the body must process nutrients, conserve energy, and returning to homeostasis. Lack of extensive divergence in preganglionic axons prevents mass activation. As I was mentioning in class, it would be really unfortunate if every time our heart rate needed to come down, if we had to simultaneously go to the bathroom, right? That would create undue stress and undue complications in our bodies. And so our activation of the parasympathetic nervous system is very much more specific. We talked about this a little bit with cranial nerve 10. So you realize that the parasympathetic nervous system is called the craniosacral division because the cell bodies originate in the cranium or in the sacrum. So we have a couple of specific cranial nerves which participate in the parasympathetic division, particularly, and as you think about this, think about things that need to be affected on that we know about, right? Like our eyes dilating and undilating. Our face, tongue and swallowing is going to be the glossopharyngeal. So salivation, pressure responses in the face. Vagus, we talked about, is going to the heart. So when you think about the function of these nerves, it kind of plays into what you already know, and then we're going to combine that with what we're learning about the parasympathetic division. So these nerves, specifically cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, cranial nerve 7, facial, cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, and cranial nerve 10, vagus, are all going to have preganglionic neurons located in the nuclei of these cranial nerves. So this is that craniosacral division. We're up here, we're down here. Head. So cell bodies cranially located travel to viscera of the head, like the eyes. We need to get to the heart, we need to get to the gut and bowels and bladder, as well as sex-specific glands. An interesting note here, the vagus nerve carries about 80% of all parasympathetic fibers. When we went through cranial nerves, I mentioned to you guys that vagus nerve, if we only learn one cranial nerve, remember this guy, it's going to come up again and again in your clinical schooling. This vagus nerve fiber, it's really important in bodily functions as we ramp up and ramp down. Already mentioned this, but in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, preganglionic fibers are long and myelinated. Postganglionic fibers are short and unmyelinated. this is going to lead to site-specific activation, which is what I want you to pull away there. So I like this diagram here because it helps you realize that, again, a lot of people talk about parasympathetic and sympathetic as contrasting nervous systems, but they're actually much more working in tandem to achieve bodily homeostasis and needed results at any given moment. So here you'll just see eyes and eyes, spit and spit, heart and heart, lungs and lungs, stomach and stomach, liver and liver, bladder and bladder. So I mean it's these are working on the same systems to help our body accomplish the things needed at the appropriate time. Another diagram here just helping to highlight this, short into a chain ganglia into then eventually long preganglionic, short postganglionic fibers, all acting on the same regions. Okay, the same regions here. Finally, this slide here is it presents some information where we can compare and contrast the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerve system. I will leave that to you. Nothing in this chart should become as a big surprise anymore after these few discussions that we've had about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve system. But if you need to go through and compare and contrast in this way, definitely do it. That finishes this short video on the autonomic nervous system.